Hello, I am Jairo Bolledo and welcome to Rappler Talk. Today we will speak to former United Nations Special Rapporteur and now Secretary General of Amnesty International, Agnes Callamard. Welcome to Rappler, Agnes.
Thank you.
Good to have you here, Agnes. For our first question, of course, first things first, the Amnesty International just released your latest report titled The State of the World's Human Rights. Can you tell us more about this report?
Yes, it is the annual report of Amnesty International, the product of 12 months of research into 126 countries around the world. This report highlights what we believe to be the global trends in 2022. And the main one that I wish to present to you now is that of double standard. In 2022, we had the Russia's aggression against Ukraine, which was characterized by multiple war crimes. That aggression resulted in a very robust response by the international community, characterized by global condemnation, a focus on the preservation of rule-based order and human rights, and borders open to refugees. Sadly, though, that robust response was only applied to Ukraine, and many other crises around the world did not receive the same level of support and solidarity. Refugees, in particular, that were welcomed when they came from Ukraine, found closed door when they came from Afghanistan, Syria, or other countries. So it is a double standard of the international community, that in particular of the Western world, that is quite marked in 2022 and is really undermining, if not poisoning, our capacity and determination to create a rule-based order that will apply to everyone, everywhere. And if I may add, the double standard actually was also something that characterized the international response to the situation in the Philippines, because the Human Rights Council last year adopted, as it should have, very strong resolution calling and putting in place a commission of inquiry for Ukraine, a commission for inquiry for Iran, a special rapporteur on Russia. But it has failed to condemn and to take action on violations by China, and it failed to take action on violation by the Philippine government and to continue to scrutinize and monitor the situation in the Philippines. So double standards were also something that applied to the Philippines.
Yeah, that's really a good point, Agnes, because it's also pointed out by various human rights groups in the Philippines and around the world. And good thing that you mentioned the Philippine context, because in the report you also touched the international body's response to different crises in the world. Specifically, what can we learn from the UN Human Rights Council's response to the human rights situations in the Philippines? How can they improve their response to the country given the double standards that you just mentioned?
Look, sadly, for the last 2 or 3 years, the Human Rights Council has been unable to act on the High Commissioner's own findings of multiple crimes being committed by the Duterte administration and possibly now by the Marcos administration. I think the High Commissioner's report stopped before Marcos got elected. Nevertheless, the Human Rights Council has failed to act on those findings. It put in place some kind of technical human rights assistance that has failed to deliver anything concrete. The Filipino government pretended, in my view, that they were taking accountability seriously. They pretended that they could deliver accountability. That meant that the ICC investigation itself was put on hold for a little while. But clearly, frankly, the Philippine government resolution to deliver accountability proved to be completely empty. We are now 3 years later with a vacuum for justice being delivered. The victims of the war on drugs have failed to receive any kind of justice, and the war on drugs has now become, a much more extensive war because so many other communities and peoples are being targeted for red tagging and other violations. So the failure of the international community to act resolutely on my own findings as special rapporteur, on the findings of Amnesty International, on the findings of Human Rights Watch, and most importantly, on the findings of the Filipino people themselves, on the findings of the Filipino journalists, media, human rights organizations. Their failure to act was a betrayal to all that you guys had done at your taking a lot of risk. It was a betrayal to the Philippine people, and we are now paying the price because nothing has been done for the delivery of justice.
Yeah. Of course, aside from the United Nations Human Rights Council, the United Nations being a superpower and the European Union can also help in exacting accountability from the Philippine government to address this human rights situation. But speaking of this United States and Europe, do you think they have done enough to press human rights under the Marcos admin, specifically the US, because it appears that the US is more concerned in meddling with Philippine politics, because especially that they were not able to do that because of the Duterte administration, and now the Marcos administration seems to be more open to the United States. What's your assessment to their help?
You're pointing your finger to the main message of our annual report, which is governments which should espouse the highest values, governments that in their speech pretend to be fighting for rule-based orders. Those very same governments are failing to take action when their national geostrategic economic interests are not at stake. And that's clearly what's happening in the Philippines, where the United States and China are waging a de facto proxy conflict on the back of the Philippines and the China Sea. And instead of the United States pushing for a human rights agenda, demanding accountability, they are, pretending that nothing is happening or nothing serious is happening in the Philippines in order to preserve or to increase their friendship with the Philippine authorities. That is, sadly, a typical example of the double standard. It is a typical example that is undermining the capacity of the international community to truly build a rule-based order. Under the Duterte government, it was China that had the upper hand. Now it is possibly the United States that have the upper hand, but one party that does not have the upper hand are the Filipino people. One party that does not have the upper hand, that is still the victim of all those meddlings and deals, is justice and accountability for the victims.
Yeah, let's now talk about on the more specific mechanisms that the European Union and the United States can use to exact accountability, specifically the Magnitsky Act and the GSP Plus privileges. Do you think they're enough to press the Philippine authorities to comply with the international standards on human rights, or basically, or probably rejoin the International Criminal Court?
Look, the act and that you are describing are important. They are, a real demonstration that, governments and legislators in some part of the world are committed to upholding human rights protection, and they are committed to hold the perpetrators of violations to account. However, those acts on their own won't be sufficient. They cannot balance out the kind of meddling and deals and double standards that we have highlighted in our report. What is needed is something coherent and something systematic. The Magnitsky Act is a great step, but it cannot provide on its own full accountability. Far more needs to be done. And yes, the International Criminal Court is an important actor in that way. Of course, we call on the Philippines to rejoin the ICC, but the ICC has made it clear that it does not need the Philippines to rejoin to conduct its investigation. So we certainly are inviting the International Criminal Court to continue its work because accountability must be delivered. The International Criminal Court 2 weeks ago has indicted President Putin because of its responsibility for the multiple war crimes being committed. That is a very strong signal to dictators around the world, to autocrats around the world, that they cannot escape international justice. I hope it is a message that Filipino head of state and other high-level officials have heard, because it means that nothing can really protect them if they are found to be guilty of having ordered, incited, or turn a blind eye to massive human rights violations.
Yeah, definitely. And of course, the Article 129 of the Rome Statute is clear that the Philippines is still mandated to cooperate with the ICC despite its withdrawal in 2019. Now, going back to the Amnesty International report and contextualizing it to the Philippines, the report also noted the continuous and entrenched impunity in the Philippines, specifically the continuous drug war-related killings and the continuous attacks on activists and human rights defenders, on top of the continuous resistance of the Philippine government in the ICC probe, and of course the resolutions filed in the both chambers, the House and the Senate, supporting former President Rodrigo Duterte. All these things, what do they say about the current administration's thrust on human rights?
Look, the report clearly shows that there has been very minimal, if at all, progress on human rights under the Marcos administration. As you have pointed out, impunity is persisting. Police killings in the context of the war on drugs is persisting. Red tagging is continuing. The lack of proper criminal investigation into killings by police officers is the norm. So far, sadly, we have seen little, if at all, any progresses under the Marcos administration. That is why we are really calling for a radical change. That administration, should make a radical step away from what happened under the Duterte government. It should go as far as indicting or certainly investigating those in power that may be responsible for the unlawful death of thousands of Filipinos. So that is the finding so far in 2022.
Yeah, definitely. And going back to the ICC, you just mentioned earlier that the ICC just recently issued warrant of arrest to Vladimir Putin. And of course, it really sounded alarm over other dictators or tyrants all around the world. And speaking of ICC, last night or on March 27, the ICC Appeals Chamber junked the Philippines' petition to suspend the resumption of the probe. Any thoughts on this, and how can this affect the Philippine government's fight in the ICC?
Look, I mean, that the news came as no surprise to me and to Amnesty International. The decision of the appeal chambers clearly demonstrate the lack of progress on accountability for drug war violations under the Duterte and the Marcos administration. You know, the pretense that criminal investigations were conducted began under the Duterte administration. It has continued under the Marcos administration. It is a pretense. Nothing is happening. Administrative steps are nothing in terms of the delivery of justice. We need proper, effective investigation, and that has not been delivered. And this is what the appeal chambers has noted, and this is why it came as no surprise that they should have rejected the demand. You know, we want to believe that international justice will eventually catch up with those who have committed the crimes under international law in the Philippines. Yes, it is taking time. Yes, it means that many victims right now are still waiting for the delivery of justice, but this is why we need to be persistent and we need to be coherent. This is why the double standard of the international community is so shameful, because it means that thousands of people are waiting for what is their due, you know, justice, accountability. It means that impunity persists. It means that the international rule-based order that some governments are so keen to put forward is emptied out because of those double standards.
Yeah. And now, under the Duterte administration, the Philippines was really put on spotlight because of the gross human rights violations. And now, the Marcos administration rose to power last year, and it will be Marcos' first year as president in June this year. And it seems like President Marcos is putting a face in the international community that he somewhat cares about the human rights situation in the country. But how can his administration really show that he really wants to fix the human rights problems in the country? And can he say that he wants to respect human rights without holding his predecessor accountable?
Well, these are very important questions. So first, I've already mentioned the fact that according to our work, our research, there has been no progress on the human rights front, or minimal progress on the human rights front under the Marcos administration. What is needed? Genuine investigation into extrajudicial killings, arbitrary detention, act of torture, red tagging, all of that constitute human rights violations. As long as we do not see effective steps taken across the board, not just on an ad hoc basis, we cannot suggest that the administration is taking effective steps to protect human rights. So the first important step must be genuine investigation into the war on drugs killings and into other killings of human rights defenders, killing of the 2 journalists last year, killings of indigenous people. All of these must be thoroughly, effectively, independently investigated, and that so far has not happened. And yes, you have made an extremely important point. Those investigations should not shy away from going as high as it must be into the chain of command, the chain of responsibilities. We have I documented as special rapporteurs, Amnesty has documented, others, human rights organizations in the Philippines have documented the incitement by President Duterte, the repeated calls for violence, killings, and indeed the protection that he offered to those responsible for those killings. So this must be the object of a proper investigation to determine whether President Duterte actually committed a crime under international law. And if he did, he should be indicted. So these are the steps that we want to see. But we also want to see frankly and very clearly, and that should happen immediately, a stop to the red tagging. That is a violation. It puts people at incredible risk. We have seen many cases of people being red tagged, then being executed. That must stop. This red tagging is a violation in and of itself. It is a violation of people's right to life. It is a violation of people's freedom of expression, freedom of assembly, and it must stop. The Marcos administration can do that today.
Yeah, just veering away from the drug war and the attacks. Of course, political persecution is still part of human rights concern. And 6 years after she was detained or she was arrested for drug-related charges which she calls trumped-up charges, Senator or former Senator Leila de Lima remains in jail, and the bail petition is still pending in 2 courts in the Philippines. And what would it mean if the Marcos administration would eventually if Senator Leila de Lima would be freed under the Marcos administration? Would this help the image?
That's another step that must be taken. Thank you for pointing it out. Amnesty International is considering Senator Leila as prisoners of conscience. It is unconscionable that she should still be in prison 6 years on trumped-up charges. So yes, that's another step that the Marcos administration must take. Now, immediately release her from this unlawful detention, which is, undermining any pretense by the Marcos administration that they, want to uphold human rights.
Yeah. For our final
There are a range of other things that the Marcos administration could do. I'm just mentioning a few here, but since I'm talking to you, an important step that must be taken is with regard to the charges brought against Maria Ressa and her colleagues at Rappler. Charges against Rappler itself. I mean, those charges should be dropped. Those charges should be dropped. The fact that Maria, a Nobel Peace Prize winner, is facing a possibility of years in prison. I mean, how more shameful does it get? The Philippines should be celebrated, Maria, not forcing her in front of judges for doing her job. And under charges which are clearly ridiculous. The law, the cybersecurity law that is being mentioned in one of the cases was not even in place at the time of the alleged crimes that was committed. So that's another example that we can put forward that the Marcos administration could take very quickly and very effectively.
Yeah, and thank you for pointing out the cases on Maria and Rappler, but aside from Maria, Frenchime Cumpio, an alternative journalist in Visayas in Central Philippines, remains in jail. Aside from, she's just one of the journalists who remains in jail. She was jailed during the time of President Duterte. A really good an indication, that the Marcos, the Duterte administration really attacks journalists and the press freedom. And of course,
Absolutely.
yeah, thank you, Agnes. For a final question, this question has been asked many times to various human rights groups, including the European Union's parliamentary. Overall, do you think the human rights situations in the Philippines became better under Marcos, or is the bar just low because of Duterte?
Look, so far, I'm repeating what I've said. We have seen little, minimal to no progress at all on the human rights front under the Marcos administration. I've already highlighted what needed to be done, and on those issues, no steps or minimal steps have been taken. We need to see effective investigation into the extrajudicial killings or alleged extrajudicial killings that may amount to 6,000-7,000 in the context of the war on drugs. We need to see a stop of the red tagging. We need to see effective investigation into the killings of human rights defenders, into the killings of journalists. We need to see the release of prisoners of conscience, Leila de Sima. We need to see the release of the journalists who are in prison. We need to see an end to all the charges brought against independent media and independent journalists such as Maria Ressa and her colleague at Rappler. As long as those steps have not been taken, there will be no true effective progress on the human rights front in the Philippines.
Yeah, of course, genuine investigation is needed. That's what already pointed out by the Human Rights Watch, the Amnesty International, and the ICC itself. And of course, the Marcos administration, 1 year had passed and little to no investigation has been made so far. And the Marcos administration has a lot of things to do to improve the human rights situations in the Philippines. Thank you so much for your time, Agnes, and we appreciate your time with us.
Thank you so much for inviting me.
Okay. This has been Rappler Talk. I am Jairo Bolledo. Thank you for watching.